Hi, my name is Brenton Harrison, and we're here today to talk about what happens to your retirement account when you leave your job. Let's get started. If you stumbled across this video, it might be because after a few years or even more than a few years at an old job, you finally found that new position of your dreams and you're just about to get rolling. But now you're looking back at the things that you're leaving with that old company. And one of the things that you found and realized is that you still have a retirement account. If you stumbled across this video, then it might be that after a few years or even more than a few years of working at an old job, you finally found that position of your dreams. You're trying to get all your ducks in a row. You're trying to get your affairs in order so that you can start and hit the ground running. And you're looking back at the job you left behind and realizing that there are some loose ends that need to be tied up. And one of those loose ends could be that you left a retirement account at that employer. And if you've never left an account at an old employer before, or you've never been in a position where you've left an account of any significance, then this is a new experience to you. And it prompts a whole lot of questions. Do you lose access to the money? If you do access it, is there a penalty for doing so? Can you take it with you? What are the things that you have at your disposal? What I thought we'd do today is go through 4 different options that you have when you leave an account at an older employer, the pros and cons of each, and the next steps based on what you feel is right for you. Option 1 is to leave the account in your former employer's plan. While this might come as a bit of a surprise to you, there's not some uniform rule that says that you have to take your old 401k or 403b with you when you go from one job to the next. In fact, you can leave that account right where it is. Now, in some situations, depending on the size of your account, that advice or that option can change. For example, there are some employers who give a minimum amount under which you will have your account transferred if you leave that employer. Let's look at an example and say that your employer or your former employer says that in order to leave your 401k where it is, once you've left that company, you have to have at least $10,000 in your account. Well, now, if you leave that job and you don't have $10,000, they're going to give you a limited period of time to transfer it on your own. And if you don't, they're going to move it into an individual retirement account for you. They will liquidate it from the 401k and they will transfer it in kind into an individual retirement account. But if you're not subject to these restrictions, people often choose to leave their plans with their former employers because of things like them preferring the investment options with the former employer's plan to what they have with their new company. Or maybe they have lower fees with the former employer's 401k than what they have with this new company that they're now moving to. A specific example of when you might see someone choose to leave their account in a former employer's plan is when you actually have someone who doesn't have a new company to go for. They've actually retired after the age of 55. And I'll explain why. If you look at most retirement accounts, like a 401k or an IRA or a 403b, they have what's called a traditional retirement age, and that age is 59 and a half. And what this age means is that at age 59 and a half, you can access the monies in your retirement accounts without worrying about paying a penalty for doing it too early. In many cases, if you access your account before age 59 and a half, you would have to pay a 10% penalty for what's called an early withdrawal. However, there is a stipulation in retirement accounts for certain plans like a 401k that says if you leave your company's employment after the age of 55, you can actually access the funds in your retirement account before 59 and a half, all without paying a penalty. So let's say that we have someone who just turned 56 years old and they have their money in a company 401k and they choose to retire. Well, if they had this money anywhere else, they would have to wait 3.5 more years to access it without penalty. But if they leave their account in the hands of the 401k, they can actually take the funds now without worrying about having to pay that 10% for an early distribution. So we've talked about some of the pros of leaving your account with your former employer, like you preferring the fees or the investments to your current plan, or you might be in a situation where you have the ability to access the funds before conventional retirement age. But what are some of the cons? Well, one of them is that since you don't work for that former employer, you can no longer contribute to that 401k. You have to be an active participant, an active employee of the company in order to contribute to that 401k. You also can't take loans against that account. So if you have a plan that allows you to take loans, it can only allow those loans while you're an employee. But if you leave the employment, you cannot go back and say, I want to take a loan using this account balance in order to do so. Option two is to roll your former account into the new company plan at your new job. Another benefit for moving your old company plan into your new company plan is you've now increased the amount that you're contributing to on a consistent basis. One of the things I talk about all the time when it comes to investing is it is more difficult to recover from losses in accounts that aren't being contributed to on a consistent basis than it is to recover from those losses in accounts where you are contributing consistently. And I'm going to give you an example and a concept that I use very frequently to drive this point home. If I give you $1 and I tell you to invest that dollar, and in the first year it loses 50% of its value, then at the end of the year you have 50 cents left. You started at $1, it lost 50% of its value, so now you have 50 cents. But if in year two that 50 cents regains 50% of its value, you do not have $1. If I say it quickly, you might think you do. Well, wait a minute. The first year I had $1, it lost 50% of its value. I have 50 cents. The next year it regains 50% of its value. I should have my dollar back. But in actuality, you don't. You only have 75 cents. You started at $1, you went down to 50 cents. And 50% of 50 cents is only 25 cents. So it's the same return, 1 year positive, 1 year negative, but you don't even get back to where you started. And the reason is when the money was low, you didn't put any new money in. If you wanted to get back to your dollar, then when the stock market took your money to 50 cents, you should have bought when the market was low. That's what we're always taught. You should buy low and sell high. But when you have these periods where you're losing in your accounts and you don't contribute any more money, it becomes very difficult to recover from those lost periods. And when you leave money in an old retirement account, that's what you're subjecting yourself to. You have a pot of money that's sitting off to the side. And even if the market is doing well 3 years in a row, in that fourth year, if you have a loss, it is harder to recover when you can't put money in that old company's 401k. But by moving these funds into your new company account, you now know that every 2 weeks or once a month, however frequently you contribute, there is money going into that account as the market moves, so that in periods of loss, you can actually buy low, which will benefit you when the market recovers. So what are the downsides? Well, one of the downsides, and the biggest one in my opinion, is that you've now tethered this account balance to your new company. So if you're in a situation where after you've made this transition, you think you made the wrong move, maybe the fees are too high, or you just want to try something different with that account, it's too late. You can't unscramble that egg. You're in a position now where you either have to wait until you leave that job, reach age 55 if you plan to retire at 55, or age 59 and a half. But otherwise, that decision has been made and cannot be undone. Option three is to roll your old account into an individual retirement account or an IRA. As we mentioned in option one, some companies actually force you to put your old account into an IRA if you don't meet certain thresholds. Opponents to this step often argue that when you move your money into an IRA that it has higher fees, especially if that IRA is managed by a broker or an investment advisor. And while we think there are certainly times where that move can justify the fee, you really only want to do so if you can understand why you're making that transition. You don't want to just do it for investment's sake. You want to make sure that you understand in what you're investing or that you trust someone who can walk through these steps with you. Aside from the potential for higher fees, which can certainly be managed if that's a concern, IRAs also don't have certain features that 401ks or 403bs often do, like the ability to take a loan from your account. And while I typically am against 401k loans, there are certainly some times when they're needed and when there's an economic benefit to taking them. So the ability to do it in a 401k is certainly a positive that you don't find in an individual retirement account. There are also those who argue that 401ks have more protection for things like creditors and bankruptcy proceedings than what you might find in an IRA. Now, I'll tell you, there are protections on both sides. There are protections for 401ks and IRAs, and you'd have to have an IRA that has a pretty high balance for it to not be protected in some form in a bankruptcy proceeding. But if you are an entrepreneur or a landlord or someone who thinks they might be subjected to a civil proceeding, this is certainly something to at least be aware of. Now, while IRAs can have higher fees potentially, they also offer increased investment options as compared to most 401ks. In most 401ks, you're limited to investing in the company's stock or any mutual funds, bonds that company might choose to have inside their 401k. But if it's not in their 401k, you could be in a position where you simply can't invest in something that you'd like to do. In an IRA, however, you have much more flexibility to choose your investments, whether it be a stock, a bond, an ETF, or even something like a real estate investment trust. An additional benefit to an IRA is that you're able to move the account as you see fit. If you'd like to try out new managers, different platforms, or even strategies such as annuities, you can do so with an IRA as you choose, while, like I said, with a retirement account like a 401k or 403b, your employer or the sponsor of that plan has much more control over what's inside of that account. So if you'd like complete freedom and flexibility in terms of what you're investing inside of that account, then an IRA might be the option for you when it comes to how to handle that old company plan. Now, you might be wondering with this option, what happens if I change my mind? What if I put the money into an individual retirement account, but then later want to put it inside my company plan? Well, thankfully, something that used to not be a possibility is now a possibility in many cases. You now find plans that actually will allow you to take money that was rolled over from a former employer and put it from an IRA into a 401k. This used to not be an option. If you were going from a 401k to a 401k, that would work. A 403b to a 401k, that would work. But an IRA, an individual retirement account into a company sponsored plan, would not work. But thankfully, this has now changed. And as long as you keep these funds separate from any other individual retirement account funds, you might find that your new company plan will accept what's called a rollover IRA into your new account. Let me explain what that means. Let's say that I opened up an IRA a few years ago. It wasn't a rollover from a previous plan. I just opened an individual retirement account. And maybe I put $5,000 in that account. And years later, I leave a company plan and I had $50,000 in that plan, and I rolled that $50,000 into my IRA that had $5,000. Well, that account is now commingled. And if I try to take that IRA and then put it into another company's plan down the line, that plan may not allow it. That account has been commingled. It is not eligible to be rolled into the company plan. But let's instead say that I had that account with $5,000 in it. And instead of rolling that $50,000 into that account, I opened up a completely separate IRA that's called a rollover IRA. Now, if years down the line, I want to take that rollover IRA and roll it into my company plan, as long as that new plan will allow that contribution, I can make it without being worried about being stopped from doing so. That's it. If you're in this situation, I hope this clarified some of the options you might have in terms of how you deal with the account from your former employer. Once again, my name is Brenton Harrison. I hope you're enjoying these videos. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the notifications so that you'll know when we're posting new content. And we'll keep bringing it to you as often as we can. Have a good one.